the link sent around. Sorry, there is a message on. The link sent around on listservs does not work. I had to find it through the GSSI website. This is Everett Myers. Can somebody check, please, while I'm actually starting?
Yeah, I will send it again. I think there was some. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can, Ugo.
Yes.
Hi.
I will send it again straight away.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because someone else also says the same. There was a problem this time. Right. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's 3:05 in Italy. It's a lot earlier where Michael is. Thank you, Michael, for waking up so early. I can see that in the meantime there's light coming from your window, so it's finally day there as well. So we are really, really grateful that you agreed to give us this seminar today. It's, of course, a great honor to have you here with us today. And your work is very relevant to what we do, because that's exactly what we are working on. This tension between cities and left behind regions is something that we are really, really interested. So really, really, thank you very much. Well, you know, you normally say that you don't have to introduce somebody very famous. This is really the case for Michael, because I guess everybody knows Michael Storper. He is professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics, but is also affiliated with Sciences Po in Paris and with the School of Public Affairs at UCLA, where he is right now. He's corresponding fellow of the British Academy. He received many prizes. I've just written down a few, but you know, you can look at his CV and realize how successful he is. He got the Sir Peter Hall Prize from the Regional Studies Association, the Founder Medal in 2016 from the Royal Geographical Society. In 2017, he got the Distinguished Scholarship Honors by the American Association of Geographers for his outstanding record of scholarly achievement and innovative contribution to the field of global economic development and the geography of urban and regional system, just to mention a few. He has an impressive amount of citations, really, you know, it makes everybody else pales, because he has over 47,000 citations, if you look in Google Scholar, with an H index of 81. So I was joking before, but not so much joking. He's talking about superstar cities, but we have a superstar researcher today, and we're very, very grateful that he has been joining us for this workshop. Let me just remind you very quickly the rules of the game. So we are live streaming this event on YouTube as well. If you do not wish to be recorded now or during the question and answer session, you are very welcome to leave the seminar in Zoom and go on the YouTube, because we are basically assuming that if you are joining us via the Zoom platform, you are happy to be recorded. Now, Michael is going to present for a maximum of an hour, and then we'll have some time after his presentation to discuss with him. So, Michael, thank you very much again, and it's up to you.
Great. Alessandra, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for for inviting me to be here. I'm really honored to participate, and I'm going to share my slides there. Okay, good. And let me, before I start, what I would like to do is acknowledge that the work I'm going to present here is part of a long-term research project that I'm carrying out with Tom Kennedy, who's at Queen Mary in London. And actually, Tom presented some earlier results on the same project in L'Aquila a couple of years ago. So I'm working on the continuation of this work we've been doing together. So some of you may have actually heard some of the earlier results that we had, and I'll bring it up to date today. All right, so with that having been said, let me just kind of launch right in, and I'll say that I'm going to talk about a phenomenon of geographical or interregional or spatial inequality. I'm an economic geographer, so that's the perspective that I bring to it. There'll be, that perspective and that of some, regional urban economics, but I think it's a multifaceted problem in the end that that scholars are coming at from different disciplines like history, sociology, political science, even anthropology. We're looking into spatial and geographical inequality today. So these are all pieces of a large puzzle. So I'm gonna talk about what it is and go over some of the data that Tom and I are using and preparing, and the issues about measuring it, and then some of the challenges in understanding causality, what we don't know enough about, and also thinking about where we're going and the future. So I'll go through a bunch of these different aspects of it. So, all right, so what is it? What is regional or spatial or geographical inequality? Well, it's a complicated topic. And again, I want to emphasize that people from different disciplines might come at it from different definitional perspectives. I think in economic geography or economics, I think we think about it as differences between regions in a variety of attributes of development that are hierarchical. So the three that I really like the most are per capita income, something a little vaguer, which we might call opportunity, and a third, which is more of a dynamic concept, which is intergenerational social mobility, or how the people of a region, how they do over a longer time span. I apologize, going to be using mostly US data because that's what Tom and I are working on, but I hope you'll see, coming from outside of the US, that a lot of the issues that are raised by using just even the US case are, with adaptation, of course, to the particular scale and context of each country. I think they're relevant issues around the developed world today, and indeed in much of the global South. So there's a scale issue, obviously, when we start to think about any kind of inequality measure. It actually, this is one of the things that drives geographers and economic geographers crazy, which is, what scale do you measure things at? Because you'll get, of course, different results depending on what scale you measure at. In the US, we think about three statistical scales, which are metropolitan regions, which are known as MSAs or CSAs. Then the core, geographical unit that we have in the US is the county, of which there are 3,114. And then still another one is the commuting zone, right? The travel to work area, as it would be said in Britain, of which there are 722, which are, kind of functional urban regions where you have an integration of the labor market, and therefore a certain kind of intra-regional price dependence of land and labor. So that's just, there are going to be some different results depending on what level of measuring people use. I would say that if we drop down below that scale to a smaller, more finely grained scale, like neighborhoods within large regions, I try not to go there in this particular kind of research, because I think there are different conceptual and measurement problems when you look at neighborhoods, simply because they're within these functional urban regions, and they are sort of within the same housing and labor markets, and they have an extreme degree of spatial dependence from one neighborhood to another that's kind of an order of magnitude greater than when you talk about interregional effects. And that's kind of important because, of course, a theme in economic geography or urban studies or anything like that, and a very important one, is the patterning of residential neighborhoods and well-being. I'm not saying that's not important. It's just that it analytically requires sort of other things to say meaningful things about. So regions, I think, however you want to define them with any of these three measures, they're probably the right scale to talk about development inequality at a sub-national level. All right, so that's just kind of thinking about definitions. Why should we look at interregional inequality? Why should we even care about it? I often say this to the colleagues who are concerned with what we call local economic development, meaning at the city level or at the regional level, that of course the local is deeply structured by the interregional or the structural nature of an economy. This I don't think needs to be said to any regional economists, but it often does need to be said to the policy field of people who work on local economic development. There's, I think, in practice, often a tendency to sort of separate what we do locally from the larger picture of the spatial development of our capitalist market economies. And that's a natural tendency because a lot of, we might say, policy action happens at the local level. And local level policy in many countries tends to be kind of like divided from national level policy, big time things like infrastructure policy and so on. There's a kind of a division in practice. That's, for those of us who study it, kind of unfortunate because it's obvious that regions are open units in a wider national and global economy, and they're structured and restructured by processes that are largely not determined locally. You know, and that's the big forces like the mobility of labor and capital, technological change, and big time national policies for things like infrastructure, housing, and even labor market regulation. So the causes of what we live through at the local or regional level are often not within the region, which is of course a real problem if you're trying to favorably affect them at the local or regional level. So they're in this interregional spatial development and allocation process. So that's a plea for us to take seriously the interregional level. I think we can come back to this, but the second point on this slide is that there is, of course, some margin of maneuver for the local to shape its development, but there are limitations, and it's likely only to be successful if what we do at the local or regional level actually accounts for what's going on in the system. Again, I don't think any scholar needs to be reminded of this, but certainly our elected officials and policy professionals do. There's often a tendency to kind of forget things and think that what we're doing at the local level is going to stand on its own. I think there's another reason to be attentive to interregional inequalities or differences, which is the last 5 years, we've seen them erupt into politics in a very, very strong way, you know, as in, for example, Trumpism or the Brexit vote. Although I don't have to say this to, I think, Italians who know that interregional differences are structuring elements of national political life when they are deep and persistent. And even the mainstream press, as you can see from this quote from The Economist, has come to understand that these differences have now become key elements in national political life, and even to some extent, they've become challenges to national unity in the very recent period. And I found this admission quite interesting that that orthodox economics, and I'll return to this theme in a minute, it doesn't really have great answers to the problem of regional inequality. I think in the last few years, because of this, we've begun to struggle with it, but we're pretty far away from having a good consensus perspective on it. that's just a standard map, of course, of American voting patterns that's now, become like standard since 2016, which is you've got a party that has a majority of the popular vote. That's the blue one, called the Democratic Party, right? It basically only wins in a few regions, but those regions account for most of the population and most of the economic output because of the strange way. This is an American particularity, but this geography, just to give you, numbers, in the presidential election of 2016, Hillary Clinton prevailed in 473 out of the 3,114 American counties. This is 28 what we call midterm elections. But even this year, Biden, who was elected, he won in 481 counties and barely, and that caused a few states to tip in his favor. But the point is that the majorities are sharply split, right? Now, these are often very tightly or narrowly split places. So don't think that everyone here is a Republican or everyone here is a Democrat, but it's indicating something about geographical political polarization. All right, so that's just kind of thinking about, setting the stage a bit. Now, let's talk about how do we measure. And actually, when you look at the literature on different scholarly output on interregional inequalities, you find lots of different ways that people can measure it. And part of this is done because of convenience, right? Because of what numbers we have. That's what we scholars do. But you could think of lots of different ways you could measure it. You could measure differences in wages, incomes, wealth, more dynamic concepts like what kind of opportunity people have, or social mobility over time, which I alluded to a few minutes ago. I think whatever country you're working in, I know this for the data on France, Britain, and America, statistical series are not available for all these over the same scales and spatial granularity. So it becomes a real, actually, challenge to look at interregional inequality using any of these measures over any reasonable time span, right? So there is not going to be a perfect solution to this problem. I think the most important thing is to be kind of careful about how whatever indicators we use and put together, that we think about how we would construct a story that's causal over time. And whether you do that very formally or whether you do it in a more narrative kind of way. And you'll see this in a minute, that I think we actually have some challenges in understanding the causes of what I'm going to document. Okay, so now let's do a few minutes of running through indicators, okay, to give you a picture of what Tom Kemeny and I have been working on. And I'll acknowledge also that there's now a bunch of scholars who are coming up with kind of similar stories. So over here on the left, this is it's what Tom and I call our spaghetti plot. That'll be good for Italians, right? So the lines are they are commuting zones in America. And what they do is they trace the hourly wages relative to the national median over a long time period from 1940 roughly up to a couple of years ago, 2017. And what I would want to call your attention to in the spaghetti, so the colors of the lines are, what we're trying to model there is the economic development classes or trajectories of different groups of commuting zones over time. So we used these are arbitrary definitions. I'll have a better one definition in a few minutes. But so the blue ones are the ones that are always high. They're the rich commuting zones relative to the median. The green ones are the ones that start out very poor and grow to be middle. So you see the definitions at the bottom. We're trying to do something like development trajectories over time, almost the way that scholars do when they do international development analysis and thinking about countries relative to the world system. So this is commuting zones relative to the national system, all right? So I'll call attention to three things here. One is, if you look at the total spread in 1940, and compare it to the spread in 2017, you'll notice that they are bigger than the spread right in the middle. So there's compression of the system between 1940 and 1980. And then there is, you might say, divergence or decompression of the system between 1980 and the present. So that's the story of first decreasing interregional inequality and then increasing interregional inequality, which is the fundamental story that I want to insist on. There are some slight differences between the beginning and ending periods of larger inequality. The first is development at the bottom. This group here of much poorer regions is not as poor. There's been compression, you might say, in the lower tail. And because most of you, I suspect, are not Americans here, this is really the story of the integration of the American South from the middle of the 20th century onward into, you might say, into the American urban system and into the American modern industrial economy, having been a very poor rural region up till then because of its history as a slaved plantation economy, where it was much poorer and more rural than the rest of the country. The other thing I think to signal here is to look at the blue lines, which is going to be a big part of our story today. These are basically, a lot of them are they are the richest places in the country, and you'll notice that they have a tendency to always sit on top of the system and for them to have a new takeoff, a distancing from the rest of the economy. And this is the superstar metropolitan regions phenomenon. Also, we'll get more detail on this when I give you a simple version of it. So this again is a summary story of commuting zone wages. It's of course much sharper, easier to read. There's a breaking point in 1980 for the system. Wages, almost any way you present this data, you're going to find that there's a convergence story in the 1940 to 1980 period. And then there's a divergence story from, I think the second series is 1990, where here you can see that there's an inverse relationship between the level of hourly wages in 1940 and their growth in the 40 to 80 period, indicating a kind of convergence. And then that relationship just completely falls apart in the second period. Another well-known now stylized fact is different kinds of people going to different kinds of places. This will become a part of the picture. So here, what we see is that the places that have a high worker share with a four-year university degree or more, so these are graduates, that they now differentially attract more graduates. And the size of these bubbles, of course, are the biggest cities. So you can see a clustering of the larger metropolitan areas up here having both a high share in 1980 and a differential growth. So a first kind of image there should be of where the skilled people are sorting themselves to. Here, another data point that helps us to understand things is that the breaking point in the unequal distribution, so these are the Gini coefficients on hourly wages, that the breaking point again is quite clear in 1980 for all the groups except those that do not have 4 years of college. And I can tell you right up front that that corroborates findings by labor economists that in America, across space, across regions, that wages have flattened out for the workers who are not graduates, anybody who does not have a university degree, but wages have polarized in cities. There is a growing urban wage premium for the college educated, very consistent with this set of numbers. Here, there's a debate in the US because the background, as you may know, to the particular American case is that among the developed countries, it has a particularly high degree level of interpersonal income inequality, especially compared to most European countries. The Gini coefficient on national interpersonal inequality is considerably higher here, with Britain being less, but somewhere in between, we might say, the continent and America. And so that leads to a debate about how much of the spatial inequality is due to the very, the extreme top tail of the national interpersonal income distribution. So what I'm doing here is deliberately slipping in a kind of inviting you to think about the relationship between spatial income or wage inequality and interpersonal income inequality. We're gonna talk about that a little more because I think it's a big part of the issue in all of our countries. But what this is meant to show is we take out the extreme, we take out the top 1%, we take out the extreme 0.1%, that's kind of like the Piketty people. We can take out the top 10%. And what it's indicating, this is kind of rough stuff, everybody, but I think what it's suggesting is it's that the polarization occurs even when we take out the extreme upper tails, less so when we take out the top 10%. So there might be some particularly strong role in geographical income inequality that's played by the top 10%, the top decile. I'll tell you in a few minutes that I think it's probably a little more than that. It probably, and that goes back to the previous slides about the college educated, which are more than 10%. They're more like 30 to 35% in America, that they are having a preponderant role in structuring geographical wage and secondarily income inequality. All right, now another debate and just another kind of framing of this subject because it relates really to the core of urban and regional economics is a debate about whether we're seeing geographical wage or income inequality only in nominal terms, but not in real terms, right? So those of you who are in this field, you know that the standard spatial equilibrium models that many economists use, what they look for is that any really big spatial price differences, notably in wages, would be mostly canceled out by higher housing costs, so that the people in the high housing cost areas, though they might have higher wages, right, would mostly have those two things canceling themselves out, or that would be a trend over time. And what we see in the US is that housing costs are rising everywhere. They're rising in the commuting zones that are, you can see at different sort of different layers in the system, right? But they're rising especially in the superstar region. So this corresponds to our, our impressions that, places like LA or New York or Milan or Paris or London are really expensive, right? They have a lot of high wage people, but they're super expensive. However, what Tom and I believe the evidence shows is that these higher costs do not equalize real incomes, that the median households in the superstar regions, of which you see some up above here, right, they remain high income even after you adjust for housing costs. And Tom and I have done a few pieces of research with using different methods here. And now there's quite a flood of literature that shows that the whatever method you use, that the skilled people in the very high housing cost areas come out as winners these days, right? That is to say, their nominal wages more than compensate the higher housing costs in those areas. And I want to be sure that you understand that I'm saying that that is for the skilled. It is not for everybody in those regions. You can see down here these much poorer commuting zones where incomes are where real incomes are actually lower, even after taking into account their much lower housing costs. And the housing cost differentials in a place like America are enormous, given the size and diversity of the country. So that actually shows up in the aggregate here. Notice again the big bubbles here, but the what you can see is that there's an improvement in larger cities, overall in the real incomes relative to the smaller ones. So this is 1980 and this is 2017. And you can see the trend here that there's a lot of improvement in real incomes in a lot of these larger cities that happen to be also the most expensive places in the country to live on average. A couple of these down here, I'm guessing these are probably, I can't, well, actually I don't know. I think they're in the South. So of course, now we know pretty much what the story is, which is that different groups in our big cities are having their fates determined quite differently. That is, the relationship between rents and household income is quite different for the groups with different education levels. And the big winner is, of course, so again, green is 1940, red is 1980, and blue is 2017, just so you have a way to read this. And what you can see is that you might say the groups that do the best in the relationship between household income and rents are the skilled people who are in a lot of the bigger cities. And these relationships are not favorable, we might say, to high school dropouts or high school graduates. That's people with less than a university attendance. And the best outcomes are where you have at least some graduate education and a graduate degree. So now that's to give you a sense that the most expensive places in the most expensive cities or commuting zones are giving differential benefits to different groups. And this really gets some kind of corroboration in this figure, where you can see that the relationship between the top decile and the median reverses from the early period to the current one, where so you see in the blue, of course, the 2017 results, in the red, the 1980 results. And there, what you're seeing is that there's a negative relationship in the past between hourly wages and the local inequality, measured as this 90-50 ratio. Today, there's a positive relationship. So the places that have the highest overall wages are the ones that tend to be more unequal. And I would suggest to you that that really corroborates the story that's emerging about the role of graduates or the college educated in the economies of certain places. So here's some talking points that I would put together from those kind of data, that it looks like spatial wage convergence is ending somewhere around 1980. And there's a big jump in divergence from starting in 1980 or 1990 and continuing to the present day. It's not entirely a story of top incomes. There's some role there, but it's not just the very, very rich. The high skilled workers are concentrating. That is to say, they are flocking to other groups of high skilled workers. They're getting wage premiums. And this again has been really elegantly confirmed by papers by David Autor from MIT, where he shows that the urban wage premium for the skilled in America is 5 to 6 times higher today than it was prior to 1980. So a worker with 4 years of university or more, the average spatial wage gap between the big cities and everywhere else in America was on the order of 5% in 1970s. It's now in the 25 to 30% range. It's a huge increase. The median worker, so in many superstars, is pretty well off in real terms because it has a big a group of college educated in it. Local inequality, on the other hand, probably higher in superstars. And there's a few papers out that confirm that. And that wasn't true before. The superstars were not more unequal than the rest of the country locally. Now, okay, so those are like some sort of stylized facts about people and places, but let's go back to the spaghetti type picture. So this is a simplified picture, and let me sort of decode what it means. And I'm sorry I didn't get to put the full labeling on it because it's stuff that Tom and I are working on sort of in real time. What we did here is we took the commuting zones of the US, and rather than imposing our own definitions of like this, high to high income, high to low income, high to medium income, that's kind of like what the World Bank does, right? When it kind of typifies things, countries in the world economy, is we decided to see if we could find a natural grouping of the developmental trajectories of our commuting zones over time. So we played around with a bunch of polynomial functions, and they gave us this. They gave us 6 groups of commuting zones, which are all of the metropolitan regions in the country. And in the question and answer, if you want, we can talk more about exactly what this means. Tom and I are working on it currently. But again, think about that earlier spaghetti plot and this simplified spaghetti. And I think you see some similar features, but with an important modification. So here we are back in 1940. This is 1940 again. And you see a pretty wide a divergence in wages, just as you did in the previous. And you see a compression. This is again in the 80s, 90s, and then you see an expansion. So now again, if you go down here, by the way, these are for each of the groups, the percentage of the commuting zones that are found in each group, not the percentage of people or output that's found in each of the groups. That's really important, right? So these are the percentage of the 722 zones that are in each of the lines. But what you find over here is, again, an expansion of overall spatial inequality, if you, again, compared to the middle, but with, I think, an important, we might say, sort of modification, and that is that actually there's been a lot of convergence in the American urban system over this period, with an exception. So the convergence is that some formerly high income metropolitan or commuting zone areas have gone down, right? These very poor ones these poorer ones and these very poor ones have come up. That's mostly a story of the Old South and what we call the interior West, which was not very urbanized. You have, again, two groups that are, we might say, we call them falling from grace, or they're moving downward. And I can tell you right up front that they are deindustrialized, formerly very prosperous city regions. You've got this group here that has done relatively well. It's a bit more of a complicated mixed group. And up here, of course, you have the phenomenon that I'm really trying to concentrate on today, which is that there was back then a group of superstars. It tended to converge to the rest of the system in this 1940 to 1980 period, and then it takes off again, so that the gap is greater than ever between a group of superstars and the rest of the economy. So that's what's summarized here in this slide. So there's really two things going on, which is a convergence of a lot of the country, but not the superstars. Now, the superstars represent, I think it said in the last slide, 3.5% of the number of commuting zones, but they represent 18% of the US population and 40% of its output. And their share of population and output has been growing. So that's the important point, right? And when doing this, I kept on thinking that I never thought of the US in the same way that I would think of as, say, France or Britain, which have each of them, a single, primate city region. In Paris represents, for the last 60 or 70 years, 23% of the French population and 33% of its output. And we were always taught, well, America has a more normal urban system. It's not, it's not a primate city, and that's true. That this top category of superstars is not a single place like London is to Britain or Paris is to France, but taken collectively, what we have is something like, this is the equivalent, almost in a bigger sense, of Paris or London in a somewhat more American version. So, and this is now, I have some other pieces that people are doing research, me and a bunch of other people, but we can now see that this is consistent with migration geographies. When we break down let me back up. When most scholarship on migration geographies, it uses this statistical convenience, which is you just do two groups. You say there's a high skill group and a low skill group, and you measure them with, again, university education or not. And I think that's a little simple, right? Because we live, in spite of increasing inequality, we live in societies where there are these big middle wage, middle class dynamics. I'm doing some work with one of my doctoral students at UCLA, and we've been dividing the population into 3 groups. And what we're finding is that the high skilled are concentrating in the superstars, and the middle and low skilled are spreading out. And that would look similar to that second spaghetti plot. An economist at Berkeley, Cécile Gobert, is finding something quite similar, which is a spatial evening out of poverty, but a spatial concentration of high incomes. And then I previously referred to David Autor at MIT, who looks at this college wage premium gap between the biggest cities and all other categories of cities. So all of this kind of, I think it sort of comes to a pretty consistent, well, a story that's emerging that we can at least sort of agree on in like the sort of, broad contours. Okay, now I want to turn in sort of the last part of the talk to just how do we interpret all this and what kind of issues are there for us to debate. So I think first of all is, should we care about this? And those of you who, who are trained in, urban and regional economics, that oddly enough, standard economics it's more comfortable with certain forms of interpersonal inequality than it is with interregional inequality. So interpersonal inequality, could reflect, it could reflect something like a, natural sort of efficiency wage setting, given a set of technologies and a division of labor in the economy. It could also affect things that are, as we know, not good from the standpoint of theory, like insufficient supply of certain kinds of workers that drives their wage premiums up. That's probably going on in part today. But the point is that the existence of interpersonal income or wage inequality isn't automatically taken to be a sign of big problems in the economy. It could be under some circumstances, but it isn't necessarily. Whereas when it comes to interregional inequality, theory is pretty uncomfortable with it, meaning standard theory, because in standard theory, we should have we should have mechanisms, meaning the mobility of capital and labor, especially though the mobility of people, migration and sorting, that should generate a mean reversion in real incomes between regions as people move from high cost regions to lower cost regions and do some kind of arbitraging or optimization of their wages and living costs and other things like lifestyles. So at least I got trained with kind of these convergence models as the standard representation of what spatial development processes at a subnational level should lead to. Now, I think more recently, we've had a bit of a revolution in economic geography and spatial economics, and we have reasons to think that there could be like efficient forms of interregional inequality because of the importance of agglomeration. That is, spatial inequality is the price that we pay because some of the industries or the activities in our economy are more agglomerated. Those tend to be more innovative and they contribute a great deal to overall economic prosperity, but the price we have to pay for them is that we have to accept a certain degree of interregional inequality. So that's kind of the new economic geography has that perspective sort of built into it, although the original models aren't clear really about exactly what they think about spatial inequality. But subsequently, we've had a debate over whether we just should accept these kind of superstar cities because they add so much to the productivity of the economy as a whole. So that, of course, I think is opens up another question, which is, well, if we have this pattern of specializations where a lot of these very high productivity, high wage activities are concentrated, is it maximizing the well-being for the maximum number of people in the economy, right? Meaning, is that giving you in the interpersonal distribution of income the highest, we might say, best outcome for the population as a whole? So these lead to somewhat different possible interpretations of the role of superstar cities. In other words, you could say, well, I need the San Franciscos and the Bostons of the world to generate all of this productivity, but it concentrates a lot of the high wage, high income people there. It gives them huge wage premiums. And that means, though, that even though the economy might have a certain level of growth, that a lot of people who are not in these places they might be benefiting by being in cheaper places, but their share of the overall economic pie might actually be smaller than it is on the interpersonal level. So it opens up, I think, what is kind of a cutting edge area of thinking about these, which is thinking about two distributions at once, interplace and interpersonal distributions, which starts to get woefully complex, but it's kind of fun to think about, right? So you can see here I already made this point, which is that I think we know that on the interregional distribution that we are not in a mean reversion process. Even if you take into account the evidence that I just gave you, that 5 out of our 6 groups of commuting zones look like they're converging, that the superstar group is not converging, indeed is actively diverging from the rest of the country, and 18% of the population and 40% of output is really a big deal. And those numbers are growing over time, all right? So even high housing prices and gentrification are not taking down the superstar cities. That's a particular local perspective here, because here in California, because of our super high housing prices, you always get the journalists now, they say the California dream is over, people are leaving, it's finished because our housing markets are so dysfunctional. It's true that we have more domestic outmigration than we do in-migration, but we continue to have such an attraction for foreign immigrants and a natural increase of our population that we're far, far, far away from any kind of leveling off of our population growth. So I think the standard theory is challenged by the data, right? It's not the issue of in or out migration. You really have to put it in the context of which skill groups are migrating. And here the evidence is that something like the top 20% of the skill groups, in spite of the high housing costs and all, are moving into the superstars. Okay, so let's pull this together, and I'm conscious of time, so give me just a few more minutes and I'll wrap it up. People and place inequalities are interacting. We need to think about how they are, and I think this is more like sort of like a research agenda that I want to sort of lay out. If we look at the American case, most of the inequality between people in incomes is due to the national income distribution that's become more unequal since the 70s or 80s, right? So if you could do thought experiments about what alternative worlds would look like you could take the interregional inequality of 1940 and 1980, all right, where there was less interregional inequality, and you could shock it by sticking in the national income distribution of 2021, and you would get a slightly higher degree of interregional inequality today, because the skilled regions back then, right, would have benefited from today's premiums to skills at a national level. But it would still leave a large residual in the inequality between superstars and the rest that we actually observe today, and wouldn't account for the fact that the superstars are a bigger proportion of population and output. So it's not just a reflection of national interpersonal inequality. I think this is really the essential point, but also it's partly that, but it's also a changing geography of the college educated since the previous period. So the growth of interregional inequality is due to the spatial concentration of the high wage earners and the fact that they're doing better in the national income distribution, right? So there's a huge wage premium on the skilled in the superstar places, right? We need to know why that's the case. And then concomitantly, why the wages of the middle and the low skilled have flattened out across the landscape, even though a lot of them are stuck living in expensive places. If you're a supermarket cashier in Los Angeles and you're a supermarket cashier in Tulsa, your nominal wages are compressed compared to what they used to be 50 years ago. So it's exactly the opposite of the skilled people. Is the unskilled people have a flattening of their nominal wages at the same time that there's greater differences in local living costs. So that's why they're suffering so much in the contemporary economy. So for causal analysis, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to think about, which is why the skilled wage premiums are so much bigger in the superstars than they used to be. And that's where I think we get into the core of economic geography, which is there's something about what goes on in these places. You know, many of us, and many I think present, you know, we think it has to do with innovation and processes like that that are in part endogenous to regions. But the point is that the local is affecting the national income distribution in a really big way, not just through migration and sorting, but through what goes on in the superstar regions, right? And it has a huge implication for the future of economic geography. So there are feedbacks, right? I could, you know, I want to end really soon, but like, depending on what kind of a public finance system you have, there are other feedbacks. So what we're seeing in America, for example, is because some of the tax receipts are calculated on the basis of local and regional incomes and are returned back, or that are levied by local and regional authorities. That, to give you our example from even within California, because the San Francisco Bay Area has done so much better in the last 30 or 40 years than the region where I am today, LA, that local tax receipts are much bigger in San Francisco than they are in LA, which enables those superstar places to invest in themselves and, of course, to reinforce their attractiveness. And notably, what they can do is invest in things like education, health, infrastructure, and amenities, which causes the skilled people to continue flowing into them, and probably now has some kind of an endogenous effect on reinforcing the superstar phenomenon. You know, there's things like power networks, which is that, you know, the networks of the people who really shape the knowledge economy are more and more in these places. And social mobility. This is research that Dylan Connor and I have been doing, showing that while the superstars are more internally unequal, they have a lot more social mobility than the other areas. So there's a dynamic effect, which may be that your childhood conditions, you might feel poor, but you're going to get ahead in these places. So I don't have time. This is, you know, I'm sort of speculating about whether the previous period in America was like the normal American history, or maybe it was a one-off, that maybe those kind of convergence periods weren't, that theory took them to be the norm in a lot of developed countries, but maybe they weren't. Maybe they were the aberrations, and we're going back to a long-term norm. And the long-term norm is where the knowledge economy gets shocked by technological revolutions. And each time you have a major revolution, you get a superstar phenomenon, which is why we saw the superstars in the 1940s and in 2020. And this is kind of like Tom and I have this model where we think about each industrial revolution, and at its peak, it generates a high degree of interregional income inequality. And maybe that's where we are today, is in the middle of a peak and a final thought. So this is that's just, I won't go over that, that's too much detail. But here's sort of a speculation, which is that we might be, that the mid-20th century period of interregional convergence, at least here in America and a couple other countries, that it might have been a one-off, that the fourth industrial revolution is now upon us, that it's going to continue to generate strong agglomeration economies for the skilled, that the urban amenities are now strongly embodied in cities again, that we're not going to see the mechanisms that led to evening out of the landscape, and that we might be going into a phenomenon that's characterized by bigger, more knowledge-intensive superstar city regions, but with a real risk of pretty long-term depopulation and impoverishment of rural regions, and we might say separate worlds between the superstars and the rest of our urban system. So it's a speculation. I don't have time to think about policy here, but if it's a speculation, if this speculation has sort of any sort of reasonable purchase on the evidence, I think we're going to have to do some deep thinking about what kinds of policies are feasible to deal with this kind of 21st century shaping of the landscape, and where some of the, what I might call sort of 20th century ideas about how you produce convergence, they might not be all that relevant anymore. So I'll end there and welcome the discussion. Sorry for talking a bit too long.
No, it was great, Michael. These are really the topics that I like the most: interregional inequality, peripheries, urban areas, interregional migration of highly skilled people. Perfect. I was really getting excited listening to you. Okay, so my apologies, because I have to leave at 4:30, because the babysitter of my son also got the vaccine and she's sick. So I have to go and get my son from school. No, I have no one else that can do that. So I'm going to abuse my power and ask my question first, since I'm the chair, because I see that we already have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure all the other people will want to ask you questions. So I'm leaving at 4:30, but Andrea Ascani will take over as chair, and he can read the questions and chair the discussion if we keep on going past 4:30. Okay, so I'll tell you why I was getting so excited. Basically, your spaghetti graphics, right? You look at the orange line, which is the top one. But what was really amazing is that you find these 6 categories. And in the Italian National Strategy for Inner Areas, we also ended up with 6 categories.
Oh,
they're
really?
not based, yes, they're not based on income. They're based on commuting time from the central places where you can get essential services. So essential services are a certain type of school, a certain type of train station, and a certain type of hospital of a certain level, right? And so basing these on commuting times, there is this national classification now that is used, and we are using, for instance, with Giulia Urso and others in my group to do research, in which we have these 6 categories. And what we are actually focusing on is your red line, pretty much. So it's this intermediate one. Although in our case, it's intermediate in the sense of commuting distance from the core of essential services. In your case, it's not, it's based on income, right? And so my first question was, because what we find is that in these intermediate places, there is some potential. And so my question was, is there a relationship between these 6 categories, this red one that you identify based on income, and also the location of these places? are there more kind of, intermediate between rural and urban places? Do you have a sense of that? Because that is what our red line would be, this intermediate one. And we find kind of the same trend, which is growing. It's where we are actually focusing on right now, of course, in the Italian context. The other one, I have another, it made me laugh when you talk about the attraction of California, because before moving to the US, I had no idea that the international migrants loved California, while actually the internal migration was not moving towards California, except that then I was asking, I was teaching, of course, regional science, I was talking about migration, and I would always ask my students, where would you like to migrate, to move, to work if you could choose? And the Americans would never say California, while the international would always say California. And the most common answer for American students was Austin, Texas. That was the number one. They all wanted to go to Austin, Texas at least a few years ago. I don't know if it's the same now, but it made me laugh because it took me back to, that point in time when I realized, what do you mean? You don't want to go to California? Every Italian want to go to California. We have no idea of the price of living there or whatever. It's like our dream, but it's not the dream of the young, at least Americans, I guess. Anyway, the second question though was, I know it seems a very trivial question, but I'm asking you this question because this is what they are asking me. They have been asking me for the past 12 months, right? Since COVID started. It's kind of ironic, I guess, that at least in Italy, but I assume in the US as well, take the case of New York, COVID did affect the most urbanized, agglomerated places, the one that were most productive. In Italy, it was Lombardy, it was Veneto, it was the north, right? Where the productivity was highest, there was more density, and so they got most affected. And so I find that very ironic because, as you showed, the divergence, right, increased, but especially in these superstar big cities, very productive city, all efficiency oriented in a sense. So do you think that COVID will actually be a discontinuity in the system, or it's just going to disappear? And, maybe for a short time, we will observe these cities struggling, but they have such a, pass me this term, resilience, that they will bounce not back, but even forward. And they will, we can forget about that, because doing work on peripheral areas, this is my worry. My worry is that the economic crisis that will follow the health crisis will actually, again, increase regional disparities. And so now everybody's talking about these large cities, and I keep on saying, well, let's not forget about the peripheral areas, because it's not like now, because of the opportunities that might have arose from these from the COVID crisis, now we can forget and say, oh no, we have to focus on the cities. So I just wanted to know a little bit your opinion on this, so I will have a better answer myself as well when they ask me.
So your first point is about, if I'm gathering right, it's like about the actual like geographical position of the different cities, and actually it ties into your remark about Austin. In your latter comment. So in America, I mean, the superstars, they do tend to be coastal. So, there's the old belt of dominant rich cities on the East Coast from Boston through Washington. There's the West Coast phenomenon, but there are some interior cities that are superstars now. And Austin happens to be one of them. It's probably, Austin and Houston, Atlanta, and Dallas are the newer stars of the American urban system, okay? And they're not northeastern coastal or California or Seattle. So, that's interesting. I mean, that's like the hardcore geography of the country. I'm not actually, so I actually don't have a good answer to that point about the actual geographical position, except that, we seem to be, we have this kind of bipolar economy on the two coasts, and then some kind of thing going on in a few spots of the Old South.
The one that were going down, were they the Midwest, like Detroit or the?
They're almost everywhere.
Everywhere, okay.
Of course, a huge part of them is the downward ones are the formerly prosperous industrial cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. I mean, at a macro regional level, that's the most striking thing, right? So aside from a few resurgent older cities, Boston went down but up. New York had a dip, but it's a comeback kid. There are a few cities, Philadelphia, but by and large, that huge, most prosperous part of America has converged toward the middle as the South and the West have come up toward it, right? With very different population dynamics. So on the income,
if you ever make a map of the ones that are in the red, the one that went up, I want to see it, because this is what we are studying in Italy. So I was just curious if the dynamics are the same between the two countries.
And we're working on that now. I think so. I think you're right. And okay, so then the second thing you're remarking on, I think, is a really big part of the public policy debate, which is, you might call it these intermediate cities that are sort of intermediate in a lot of different ways, geographically, in terms of economic performance, and all of those questions about so-called trade-offs between economic performance, lifestyle, quality of life, and all that. Now, you get into like the realm of like subjectivity and taste here. In America, a lot of these cities offer pretty nice living conditions for, moderately waged people. Our numbers tend to show that their real incomes are not as high as the skilled people in the superstars. So that now we're going from economics to, kind of like philosophy, or how you evaluate that. I think the problem that I see in those numbers is that the economic power network, so the actual social and political and economic power, they're really flowing to the superstar cities. That these places, as we know, you have a brain drain out of them, just like you do in a lot of Europe. All the smart kids who come from provincial cities and they end up going to, Milano or Paris to make their lives. That's exactly the same phenomenon that we have here. And I think what we're living through right now, and I'm going from economics now to politics, is that it opens up such a huge gap in perceptions and lifestyles between different parts of the country that, it leads to some kind of form of instability. And on your latter comment, middle skill Americans, they're leaving the superstars. There's a net out migration because, they're comfortable culturally going to a lot of the country. And frankly, it's not such a great deal for them to stay in the superstars anymore. What is a good deal for the superstars is if you are a highly skilled person, whether American or foreign immigrant, or if you are a relatively poor foreign immigrant, because the entrepreneurial conditions in the big cities, it may be hard to live there, very expensive, but if you're a poor immigrant and you want your kids to plug into either dynamic entrepreneurialism or even in 2 or 3 generations into the knowledge economy, it's better to go to San Francisco than it is to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So this is like the kind of complex mechanics of our systems today that we're trying to struggle with.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask Andrea Ascani if he can take over the lead of the discussion, leading discussion. Andrea, are you there? There are a lot of questions in the chat, in the Q&A, so yes, ask for a while. Right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Alessandra. Thanks, Michael, for your talk. I would go on with a question by Alberto Marzucchi. I see he raised his hand. Alberto is an associate professor here at the GSSI.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm fine if I'm at the end of the queue. If you want to give priority to the external people, that's perfectly fine. Up to you to decide. Otherwise, I'll go quickly.
Please go ahead. Then read the questions in the chat.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk, Michael. It was very interesting. Although I'm coming from a slightly different perspective, and so I'm wondering, like, to what extent your results, especially those related to high skill and superstars, are not, in a sense, already explained or partially explained by the literature that you were already mentioning by David Autor. You know, high skilled in superstar cities could actually be equal to non-routinizable creative jobs that he's talking about. And so potentially your speculation at the end of the talk is very well placed and could find a support in that kind of literature. That's my short comment and questions. Thank you.
No, I actually completely agree with what you said. You know, and like, but the one thing what I was trying to do there is like, so no, Autor's results coming from labor economics are very important ones. It's more the how we put those results that are coming out of labor economics. Secondly, to like the spatial economics of migration, that's a second element. And the third is, of course, agglomeration economics. That those are three slightly different fields, and we don't have one single, you know, unified model of how they all work together. So each of them is like a component, and they're partially overlapping. And I think that's kind of where, you know, if I were to dream about like some really big theoretical synthesis, I'd want to see all of those things put together in one effective model. So that would be one dream. A second dream would be the, and I think this is really lacking in a lot of the, I think it's lacking in a lot of the econ literature, is a time perspective, which is, you know, all these really good papers that are, you know, getting at, you know, skill bias, technological change, and wage premiums and stuff like that. It's sort of like it drops out of nowhere, you know, or everything is like there was an external shock and we don't have to deal with it. Although exactly, you know, I mean, I think we know that the external shock was the third industrial revolution, but you never see it explicitly modeled, nor do you see what Tom and I pick up on, which is these kind of cycles of convergence and divergence. It's almost like, you know, the past doesn't exist. And the other thing I think that we would say that's kind of questionable is, therefore, the canonical spatial mean reversion convergence model. I think all of that are really interesting elements that come from different parts of different fields, right? Academic fields. And it's sort of a matter of seeing, you know, how they all work together in the period that we've been living through, and kind of coming up with what I would call it more complete explanations moving forward.
Cheers, thanks.
Right, there's a long queue of questions. I'll read two questions from the external audience, and then I'll give the floor to some internal question. So there is a question by Augusto dos Santos Pereira, a geographer from Brazil. He asks, what does Professor Storper think about the work of neo-Schumpeterian economists like Carlota Perez regarding techno-economic paradigms? I would like to know if Professor Storper finds possible or even of interest that geographers work on an explanation of different levels of regional development based upon what we could call a geography of techno-economic paradigms, considering that those superstar areas seem to be the spearhead of the development of new technologies. And how does artificial intelligence relate to this?
I think that's a great question, and I would consider myself to be in that broad line of thinking. In fact, like the first book that I ever did with Richard Walker in the late 1980s was, I would call it very strongly inspired by the neo-Schumpeterian perspective of that you have these waves of technological change. The language I've been using is somewhat different, but it has a lot of sympathy and overlap to the work of people like Carlota Perez. So I think what we're starting to do now is take that further, and people who work on innovation and the geography of innovation, we have all kinds of new, both conceptual, new concepts, and we have new, better data. So we're working on things like how to measure general purpose technologies and how they come about like in a kind of a Schumpeterian way, and how they shock the economy, and exactly how the agglomeration dynamics work, and how hopefully they work, you know, to create these migration patterns and spatial wage premiums. But all in all, I think, you know, your question is exactly right to suggest the lineage of the kind of thinking that I'm exposing here back to people like Carlota Perez and others. And you're right, looking forward. When I mentioned the fourth industrial revolution, that's what I mean, is things like robotics, artificial intelligence, obviously the biogenomic industries, the green technology industry. We're trying to think about that as either an extension of the third industrial revolution in technological and spatial terms, or is it going to have a different geography? And that's a very critical, it's a very critical subject for economic geographers, because the fate of our urban systems really, in a sense, depends on it, right? So as we start to think about the 1980 period to the present, and think about what are the lessons for the period we're going into, those are exactly the kinds of issues I think we should be thinking about.
Yeah, thanks. There's another question from Francesco Nurra. He posted the following question. Thank you for this thought-provoking lecture. Do you think that uneven development is too theoretically old-fashioned to explain inequality between the superstar regions and the other regions?
Well, that's a great, so yeah, I mean, you know, I was raised with that language, right? That language of uneven development. And it's still, I mean, we know that it's a very relevant concept for thinking that, you know, capitalism doesn't develop evenly everywhere at once. And so this is a starting point if you are, I think, an economic geography or a spatial economist, is to understand that. Although let's kind of make the editorial point that I think that's where, you know, those like mean reversions or convergence models, whether you have them internationally or subnationally, they've limited the theoretical imaginary of a lot of economists who are constantly looking for convergence, right? It's like, you know, it's like, look through the evidence and find the hidden convergence tendency. And I wouldn't deny that. I mean, there are convergence mechanisms that are hardwired into our economies. But there are all, and this is the point, a more balanced perspective over time is to see that development is something like a struggle between the mechanisms for convergence and the shocks that produce new divergence. And those shocks, that's where I'm going to be the neo-Schumpeterian once again. The shocks are strongly technological because the technology shocks are inbuilt into our system, right? That's actually why capitalism is successful at all, is because it's technologically dynamic. And technological dynamism doesn't happen everywhere at once. It has a very strong spatiotemporal uneven process that then is followed by diffusion dynamics and all the conversion stuff. But if you don't have a kind of like a theoretical framework that thinks about both convergence and divergence forces at the same time, I think we're not thinking, you know, clearly enough about sort of how the system moves forward. And that leads to kind of I think, frankly, it's the kind of the worry that I have is that we've entered into a period of, we might say, successive or even ongoing technological revolutions that are very strongly favoring large metropolises and divergence processes. And again, it's a personal guess that I could be wrong about, but that are going to be quite durable in the 21st century. And that we have to be prepared for the possibility that the convergence dynamics of the 20th century might not be coming back for a long time.
All right, thanks. I would propose 2 live questions. We had Ugo Rossi in the queue. He's an associate professor here at the GSSI.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for your great talk. My question revolves around perhaps the key issue, why some cities become superstar cities. As you know, people like Glaser pointed to the role of natural amenities, people like Florida to cultural lifestyle in a way. Other people theorize the business ecosystems, the variety of economic activities, or some people, including myself, also point to the role of the political construction of superstar cities, especially in Europe, like in Italy, Milan. There was a lot of public investment, and not just public investments in the sense of money, but also of marketing, you know. Also Barcelona is another example of this. Or is as the previous question put it, the result of intercity competition and even development, international division of labor, or is a mix of all these factors, or if you think that there is one key factor behind the ascendancy of some superstar cities. I think the case of New York City is particularly interesting because New York City lacked it was even declining in the 70s and the 80s. Then it was lacking any kind of specialization in technology, in high tech. And then it has become a prominent tech hub, global tech hub. The same also London in some respects. So why cities like New York and London, maybe the question is because they are New York and London, and so they attract venture capital. So I think it's quite a dilemma of why some, and we should try more to provide an answer through a model or I don't know, to this kind of, to this substantial question, why some cities become superstar cities. Thank you.
Ugo, I totally agree with you on that. So one of the things that like Tom and I are going to try to do, we're starting to work on it, is, you know, that group of superstars that I identified in our spaghetti plot is we're trying to think about if we can do a causal investigation of why those cities are always on top in the American case, with the idea of giving us sort of like structured insights into what it is. All the factors that you named would be candidates for an explanation. And it's one of the great, I think it's one of the great like sort of missing parts of our knowledge in economic geography and urban studies. Is this specific, you know, why these places, you know, what is it about these places, not places in general, but specifically them. And so again, I don't actually have the answer to that. I think it's a missing part of our results. And again, I couldn't agree more with the examples you gave. You know, if you look like, again, to use the American evidence, you know, you've got San Francisco and Boston as the original third industrial revolution places. They both do just fine. San Francisco is much bigger and more important, but New York is it's like a resurgent tech center. Quite surprising, you know, we thought New York was finance and manufacturing. The manufacturing went away and New York, very prosperous on finance, but now New York is a major tech center. Sharon Zukin, a sociologist, just wrote a book about it, and it's quite a good book that tells you on the ground how it happened. Austin, Texas, which was Nowheresville, is now a major metropolis and a superstar one that grew almost from nothing. So, but again, you're totally right. We need to get more consistent, rigorous comparative knowledge of whether there are identifiable characteristics of the superstars that makes them superstars. And it should be evidence over time, because the superstars they have ups and downs, but they tend to stay on the top over multiple economic cycles. And so there's something about them that's different, or my hypothesis is there's something about them that is different over the long run from other parts of urban systems. So I think this is a major problem for us to solve.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another live question from Fabiano Compagnucci, is also an assistant professor here at the GSSI.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. I lost you. I missed you in Paris in 2010, and finally I got your presentation, which was extra. And yes, basically I would like to know your opinion about two issues. The first one regards the fact that, as you told us, the convergence process stopped basically in the 80s. So there are a lot of studies about this phenomenon. We know also the grid decoupling, for instance, no? So the grid decoupling between productivity from one hand and median income and the number of employees from the other. So basically, again, a problem of structural change, we can say, a problem related to the robotization, the first wave of robotization in industrial plants. And since then, we witness basically a redistribution of income from workers to capital. So could be maybe, okay, it's good to increase, of course, the human capital, the level of human capital, but maybe it's also a problem of wages, basically. So what about the income policies, including universal income? Because of this, I can say, transfer shift from worker, the income from worker to capital. And if I may, the second issue is more technical. I focus my research activity is focused on inner areas, and I also use travel to work areas in order as a unit, territorial unit of analysis. But for instance, in the Italian case, it's really a problem because using travel to work areas in inner areas is misleading, because I can say you map these travel to work areas by means of commuting flows, and in our commuting areas the commuting flows are so low that you put together some municipalities which are not so interconnected actually. And I would like to know if in the United States it's the same. You know that in Italy we have a very polycentric territorial organization. So we have people scattered everywhere on the top of the mountains and everywhere. So just to know if you remarked a similar problem. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, those are really, so let me, great. On the first issue, I think let me sort of almost expand what you said. There's a major issue today of how interpersonal, or let's call it wage inequality, relates to spatial inequality. All right, the two are clearly interrelated. And I mean, I think here in the US, we're just beginning to have a debate about how the two relate. There's great concern, like everywhere, with the high level of wage and income inequality. Okay, so that's taking space out. So one question I think that I've seen people debating is, if we let's say that we had a set of policies that start to reduce wage and income inequality, what would that do to spatial inequality? Well, you could imagine a scenario where if the greatest concentrations of the high wage people and their greatest wage premiums are in these superstar cities, and you compress the income distribution, that almost mechanically that would cause the per capita incomes or the average wages of these big places to converge toward the others. So you might be able to have like an indirect way into dealing with spatial inequality. Okay, so now I have some friends who think that that's really how we should go. I'm a little bit reserved about that for a couple of reasons. One is that the sources of this wage inequality, I mean, all the labor economists, they think it's skill bias technological change and some kind of shortage of the skilled. We economic geographers, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, we think there might be actually an endogenous component in that, you put these people together and they get much more productive. And so I think there's a real issue for like geography types or, spatial types to enter into this emerging debate over which part of these spatial wage premiums is due to real kind of organic productivity of these agglomerations versus just overpaying these people because they're an elite and because they're in short supply. I see a huge debate that we have to have. That's number one. Number two is, though I find the inequality in places like Milan or San Francisco or Paris to be quite upsetting, as most of us do, when you look into the local multiplier effects, so like Moretti multipliers kind of thing, what you see is that the local multipliers in a place like San Francisco are really different from what they are in provincial cities, because there's a lot of people spending a lot of money on expensive local services that actually lower skilled people are, we see it in the social mobility statistics, which is that people without a lot of formal education have a much higher probability of forming a business and actually having decent incomes than they do in smaller provincial cities. Because now I know this sounds kind of like noblesse oblige, like the rich people spend their money and the poor people get the crumbs. But there is an economic truth to it and people are measuring it. So I think those are all really complicated issues that we have to go further on. That's number one. And I think your second point about commuting zones, my guess is that American commuting zones are cleaner than they are in Italy. And I know this because I think Italy and France are kind of similar, and I know the French numbers pretty well. And that's it, we're a bigger country. And we know that the average American city is more specialized than its European counterpart, and that urban productivity premiums are higher in America than in Europe. We found this when a few years ago when Riccardo Crescenzi and Andres Rodriguez Bose and I did a kind of a Euro-American. So I think comparison, I think it's because the commuting zones, they're much more, it's different because you have just a different geography of population and granularity in a country like Italy from America, right? So I think you're totally right about that.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, thanks. So there are more questions in the chat. I'll start reading one by Davide Luca. He says, there's a deep tension between attempts to address the geographies of political discontent and new economic geography style stories showing that there's no way to counter agglomeration during an industrial revolution. So what role is left for regional rebalancing policies?
Oh, that is such a hard question. I think we're all terribly concerned with this issue. And I don't know. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know. And I'm very worried about it because my research and what I've tried to summarize for you here suggests that these kind of underlying market forces are very, very powerful. So and I will even say, so, like if you think about a European or American comparison, and again, I'll draw on France because it's the European country that, I know the best. We do a lot of spatial redistribution in France that we don't do in America. That is to say, we have, a system of public services, infrastructure, schooling, and quality of life measures that are much more redistributive than they are in America. And I wouldn't say it's unsuccessful. I think that the tensions are lower in France on average than they are in America. So that indicates that those kind of policies can have some effect. However, when you dig deeper, you still see a lot of the same structural problems that we have in America. The underlying forces of pulling the skilled, knowledge-based industries and all of the social networks and all that stuff into superstar metros is going on in France, and there's discontent elsewhere. So I guess what I'm saying here is we need to think much more deeply about the possibilities or the kinds of policies we need to carry out. So I think a minimum is quality of life, community development, basic services, very strong redistribution on that level. But it's what I would call necessary but not sufficient. And that leads to, I think, one of the hardest questions for spatial economics and economic geography, which is, can we think of like an alternative geography of the knowledge-based economy? Is it possible to think about a way to spread to kind of have a different granularity or a different overall arrangement of our agglomerative forces? That, goes back to old traditions of like thinking about spatial planning and all of that. I'm a little bit skeptical. In fact, I'm quite skeptical because we know what happened in the past is we didn't have a lot of success with that stuff. And I think in a dynamic knowledge economy, it's even harder to predict the future of what the industries are and what their agglomerations look like. But at the very least, we should have, we should have a scholarly and policy debate about it. We have to have an open mind because I'm worried about naivete, right? It's like, industrial planning in the past didn't work very well. So no point in wasting time and money, but we should at least think about it because I don't think just kind of redistributive, policies are going to be enough to offset the geography of discontent. That's why it's so worrisome.
Yeah, that's right. There's a further question by Kerstin Schäfer from University of Hannover in Germany. She's also very intrigued by the spaghetti graphs. She asks, I find it very interesting that the places with the highest wages experience decreasing wages and then the wages increased again, while the wage in the other regions seem to converge. What do you think made the wage in those leading places decrease at first? And the range between the lines seemed to be smaller at the end of the graph. Does that mean that the gap was larger in the beginning?
Yeah, so I think broadly what was going on is that in the 1940 to 1970s, 80s, that kind of period roughly, the convergence in wages was because we were still in the second industrial revolution, meaning the mechanical, electrical or manufacturing world. And that a period of economic development in America we were seeing the spreading out of those activities. They were de-agglomerating from an earlier 20th century peak of agglomeration when that revolution was young. as it aged, the manufacturing economy spread out, and with it, it spread out both the semi-skilled and the skilled workers to more places, leading to spatial wage convergence. It also, as the technologies were becoming more and more routinized, the premiums for the skilled were declining. So that led to less interpersonal inequality. So they all worked in the direction of the decline of the two kinds of inequalities over that period. And then, subsequently, there was a huge technology shock, third industrial revolution, and it just blew the old system up because it created the skill bias technological change and the need for more knowledge workers and higher premiums on their work and higher agglomeration. So it's like it threw the system, into reverse. So I think that's kind of why I was saying a few minutes ago that I feel like economic geography and spatial economics, we need to have a time perspective. We need to put what's going on today in the context of the past. It gives a much better context to what are the causal mechanisms today. If you take them just alone, you don't see this key role for big technology revolutions and how they reshape the space economy. They reshape wages, they reshape agglomeration patterns, they reshape migration flows, right? So it's having that longer term perspective that enables us to see these things more clearly in a causal sense.
Yeah. All right. She thanks you very much. There are a couple of questions left. I think we can answer them by 5 and not accept more questions. So the next is from Nora Geirsdotter Bekkelund. She is an innovation geographer from Bergen in Norway. She says, you mentioned that the superstar cities have higher social mobility. At the same time, standard theory indicates that people would move to improve their standard of living, which is what you see with the concentration of the college educated. How do you account for geographic mobility when measuring social mobility within regions?
Actually, Dylan Connor and I recently published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences here in America. And we did that by using matched census records over more than 100 years. And what we found, I think implicit in your question is exactly the right idea, which is that part of social mobility is tied into geographical mobility. So part of the people who have high social mobility, at least in the American case, are those who grow up in one region. So they have early childhood conditions from one region, but you might say they realize their potential by moving. So there's a big difference between movers and stayers intergenerationally. So yeah, but you have to track it, over a relatively long period of time by tracking people through the system. So, and there's an interplay, right? When you look at social mobility of, again, those who get it by moving versus the regions that, if you grow up in a region, what's the probability and you stay without geographical mobility that you'll have intergenerational social mobility, and that differs across regions. So now I'm not sure that evidence translate, like internationally. I think countries obviously have really different institutional systems, but it is the kind of stuff that we found for the American case. And if you can if you're interested in that topic and want to see how we did it, you can, find that, I think, online on PNAS, and you kind of see how we're dealing with that.
All right, thanks. Question from Shruti Malik. This question mentions the book of Karen Rosenkrantz, an ethnographer that has written a book called City Quitters, where she explains that there is a trend that can be mapped among the creative professionals of the city to quit these superstar regions to pursue a simpler and more fulfilled life, a post-urban life. So these emerging migration patterns could be a result of concentration of high incomes, which further takes away a balance from the region. So the question is, what could be the impact of this and how strong and real is this trend?
That's really interesting. And the answer is, I don't know, right? Meaning, you know, and by the way, that kind of, I think your remark connects back to a few people mentioning COVID and post-COVID, right? So we have like journalistic accounts in the last year of, you know, people leaving the expensive cities, and I think I didn't address this earlier, you know, places like Milano were hit hard early on because they're so connected. Subsequently, everywhere else was hit too, though. So we know it's not density, we know it was connectedness that hit these places early. But yeah, so I think we don't know, you know, like there are clearly, you know, parts of we're 40 years into this knowledge economy thing. And I think it has tensions built into it where, and this will be a generational thing. Is there going to be part of the kind of young knowledge generation that's going to go, I've had it with this, I don't like this anymore, and I want to live differently? I don't, at least in the American data, we haven't been able to pick up on it really strongly. But it could be that an ethnographer or anthropologist is picking up on early signs, and that, you know, 10 years or 15 years from now, we'll see them statistically. I have no idea, and I have no idea whether, I mean, look, my guess is that the knowledge economy has such strong incentives that you know, young knowledge workers are going to come back to the city and pick up after COVID. But you know what? We could all be wrong.
Yeah, that's right. All right, Michael, there's a very, very last question, and then we let you go. This is by Rodrigo Cardoso from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He says, the graph showing the wage convergence and then divergence coincides with a decade of radical economic political changes in the US and in Europe, Reaganism, rise of finance, deregulation, etc. You mentioned technology and the third industrial revolution, but is it possible to integrate these political changes in your research? And if so, how? And can you speculate whether the same technological progress under a different politics would make us be looking at a very different graph today?
That is a great question. And let me explain why. So you're exactly right. There's a debate about the sources of both spatial and interpersonal inequality. And it's sort of like, you know, the debate's been rather polarized. On the one side, you've got sort of like technology and skill bias technological change and agglomeration forces. And on the other side, you tend to have more of a institutionalist view, right? Sort of a political economy view, neoliberal, Reaganistic, Thatcheristic kinds of institutions and all that. And okay, my feeling about it is that these two are complementary rather than opposed arguments. And my friend and colleague at the London School of Economics, I borrowed this idea from him. His name is David Soskis. And David has, I think, the idea that when you have major technology shocks in capitalism, what happens is that they tend to undermine the existing institutions. They tend to blow up the interest groups and the points of, we might say, leverage that existing institutionalized constituencies have. So the core one there would be labor unions in the old manufacturing economy. Once the third industrial revolution came along, it radically destabilized their power. It also induced a crisis of public administration because of the levers of like stimulating growth. And it of course opened up new fractions in the, we might say, the elite, you know, the economic elites. And so without being deterministic and saying that a new technology, like a new technological revolution automatically produces new institutions. I think what it tends to do is open up periods of contestation over institutions. And as it happened, especially in Britain and America, they went in a rather what we would today call kind of neoliberal way. In continental Europe, there were some differences in how that came out. But in all cases, I think the two are not opposed explanations, but rather complements to one another. And so that leads, like if we look forward, I think we're seeing ongoing like experimentation as technological change rolls over our economy with what kinds of institutions are we gonna construct that shape and channel these technologies, as well as their negative externalities and all that kind of stuff. So again, I think that's also a way forward for research.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael, for the last answer, but also for your presentation and the whole discussion. That was really stimulating and very insightful. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. We really hope we can invite you soon over here, face to face.
That would be great.
Fingers crossed about that. Yeah, it was just great. So thanks very much again, and thank you very much to everybody in the audience.
Thank you everybody for coming, and I really appreciate the super interesting questions and debates.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye, Michael.
Thank you. Bye.